Content warning: this story contains references to suicide, attempted violence, public humiliation, and emotional abuse. These scenes are treated with care and are not glamorized. She had been good at it. Too good. She had braided her life into the family ledger. Long nights drafting grant proposals, sleepless months negotiating hospital wards, the slow, patient labor of turning favors into fortunes for brothers who boasted their names as if they'd earned them. Shen Qingyang remembered the texture of that ledger like an old scar. She remembered the smell of pineapple cake cooling on a window ledge in a kitchen that never smelled like home for her. She remembered a pendant that had been tucked into her palm by a child she had raised as a sister, and she remembered how, in the end, the ledger had been set on fire with a match of accusation, and the pendant had been snatched away. Memory arrived in short, precise cuts: the flash of a lawyer's cigarette, the hush of a boardroom counting votes, the sound of the crowd as accusations landed, then the shaking hands of the men who had written her sentence. Now, reborn, or rather returned, Qingyang sat at a small lacquered table in a compact office that smelled faintly of green tea and disinfectant, waiting while three men who had once called themselves her family celebrated a fortune they had not earned. On the newsfeed behind her, a live broadcast replayed the gala at Shen & Son's tower: crystal chandeliers, a dozen camera drones hovering like metallic insects, and three silhouettes at the head table, her three brothers, smirking as the anchor recited earnings and their philanthropic pledges with practiced blandness. Shen Qingyang, the eldest, had the unshakable composure of a man who had learned to translate cruelty into corporate strategy. He carried the chair of the conglomerate like a crown and used it to prop his ego. Shen Boyang, the middle son, conducted the numbers like a surgeon, precise, clinical, indifferent to the small human costs. Shen Yutong, the youngest, smiled too brightly and said the wrong things in the wrong moments. He was the public voice, the image manager who could make a scandal look like a market correction. They had once made a spectacle of condemning the only person who had truly loved them in a way that left no ledger entry: Shen Ziyang, Yuer, the adopted sister everyone blamed when the family needed a human scapegoat. The brothers had framed her for embezzlement, staged humiliations that trended overnight, and watched as the court of public opinion executed a sentence before any judge had spoken. Yuer's life had been torn. The family had pretended the wound was someone else's to bear. Qingyang had died in that lie, offered to the hungry mouths of their reputation.
Her first life had ended in a sterile room, the fall of a curtain, the sick calm of betrayal. There had been a night when she had thought unmaking herself would be mercy, a moment of panic under the fluorescent lights, a rolled-up prescription bottle on the nightstand. But death had not been gentle. It had been a public opinion lynching, dressed in legal robes. In the second life that awakened her, she had found her body intact, her mind sharpening with an old secret. She had been trained by the Tianji Pavilion, a shadowed think tank that sat at the crossroads of medicine, policy, and social engineering. The pavilion taught her to calculate restoration the way a steward calculates interest. It taught her that the ledger could be rewritten, that favors and debts could be balanced without the cruelty of instant annihilation. She had not returned as the woman they had thrown away. She returned modestly, with a thin coat and a name no one in the tower would remember. She took a temporary consulting position with a municipal public health initiative, steering clear of the conglomerate's glare. By day, she reviewed supply chains and production lines. By night, she slipped into the pavilion's server rooms to extract old notebooks, experimental formulations that were never released publicly, and emergence algorithms that mapped how rumors spread like viruses. She fed the weak and kept the strong in place, her hands on the small machinery of life, sewing up a broken charity's payroll, advising a community clinic on distribution of an effective tonic that mitigated a seasonal respiratory flurry. Small savers, gifts that smell of pineapple. It began quietly. In a clinic an hour from Shen & Son's tower, a small outbreak threatened to close down a vital community supplier. The director, an exhausted woman named Liang, who had a habit of folding her hands between her knees when she felt the ground shift, did not think she could afford clinical trials. Qingyang listened to Liang's fears, and late into the night the pavilion's lab sent over a formula tested for rapid stabilization. It was not miraculous, not at all. It worked in measured doses, in a way that required discipline and logistics. Qingyang did not take credit. She relabeled the shipment, added handwritten instructions, and slipped a note that read, "You can do this." Liang cried when the first patient stabilized. Small miracles are strategic. They seed trust and create debts that cannot be wiped away by a board resolution. In the months that followed, more people began to whisper about an anonymous benefactor who saved clinics, stabilized local farms with resilient seed strains developed in the pavilion's greenhouses, and trained young technicians in tools that outmatched the conglomerate's hired specialists. The pavilion had been a rumor once, a myth about old scholars in a mountain villa. Now it had a modern face, Tianji Institute, registered, legally discreet, financially opaque.
Qingyang was its principal director in every meaningful way. To the public, she was an adjunct advisor. She let the brothers believe she was gone. She let them look at the empty place she'd once occupied and breathe the relief of victory. They toasted their wins and invited cameras to capture the performance. They praised each other for rescuing the company's image without a trace, a phrase that made Qingyang's jaw tighten because it reduced a human life to a problem solved. Yours was a liability, Qingshan had announced in courtrooms and interviews. Internal mismanagement, personal failings. He had used words like liability as if he were discussing assets, never a person. Bo Yang, with a ledger always at the ready, signed the statements with a flourish of a satin tie. Yutong smiled, an apologetic grin for cameras that most of the time said, "Trust me, we have everything under control." They had believed the public's memory was a river they could dam. They had not noticed how a trickle can gather, how quiet work can make a flood elsewhere. Qingyang, patient as an old gardener, allowed her roots to entangle with weaker vines. An uncle no one took seriously became the owner of a small logistics startup she quietly underwrote, training his staff in the pavilion's transparent supply methods. A former nurse who once took orders from the Shen household found her way into a research partnership. A disgraced junior associate at Shen & Sons saw his career slowly resurrected through honest mentorship Qingyang arranged. At a low-stakes event for community investors, Qingyang appeared as a speaker on emergency logistics. She wore a blue coat that had been mended by her own hands. She spoke about supply chains and patient dignity, her voice precise but not theatrical. When she walked off stage, a young reporter pushed through the crowd and asked about her relationship to the Shen family. She smiled, a small economy of expression, and said, "People change, companies change. We all owe each other second chances." The clip lasted 30 seconds and was retweeted 4,000 times. The brothers' PR team called it a charming curiosity. Jingshan watched it with the impatience of a man who expected to see the world respond to his commands. "Who is this woman?" he asked at the head table, eyes skimming the social feed. His aide shrugged. Bo Yang ordered an analysis. Yutong scrolled through the comments, annoyed. They ordered the first attempt to decode her then, a team of analysts, social media forensics, and private investigators. They wanted to map her moves, reconstruct her finances, deduce her motives. It was a modern inquisition, data points for confession. They scraped purchase histories, cross-referenced IP addresses, hired behavioral economists to witness how a person who had no apparent stake in their fortunes could dismantle their narrative. They found patterns, but no key. They saw donations routed through shell companies tied to non-profits, but no signatures. They found leaves of research papers with her name redacted, but no direct links to the pavilion's public face. They collected footage of her standing before community clinics and compiled the footage into a dossier labeled Potential Threat Vector. The analysts proposed a psychological profile, a woman driven by loss, possibly seeking reparations. The younger consultants, creatures of surveillance and algorithmic certainty, were sure they could predict her next move. Predictability is a comfortable myth. Qingyang, who had endured a life of sacrifices mistaken for meekness, had learned how to weaponize unpredictability. She let them hunt. Each time they thought they had a thread, she unwound it in plain sight, replacing a trap with bread. At a shabby tea house, she left a plate of pineapple cake with a note, "For the interns who work too late." At the community clinic, she handed a jade pendant to a boy whose fingers trembled from a fever not yet treated. These were not manipulations. They were reminders of what she had once been and why she had chosen to return. The pendant, that small carved circle with a hairline fracture, had been a gift from Ewer years before. To Qingyang, it was memory. To the world, it became a motif. Their decoding attempts grew clumsier. One analyst recommended releasing a leaked dossier tying Qingyang to foreign funders in the hope of discrediting her as an agent of outside influence. Jinshan liked the idea. Contagion must appear foreign to displace anger. Boyang liked numbers. He commissioned a report that tried to link the pavilion's grants to past embezzlements, an exercise in confirmation bias dressed as investigation. Yutong suggested a softer approach. Invite her to a panel, observe her responses, coax a confession. They underestimated the patience of a woman risen from ashes. The first real public test happened at a charity gala. Shen & Sons hosted the event to present their restoration initiative, a tax break-friendly spectacle that would absolve some of the conglomerate's earlier missteps. The dinner hall was a glass orb of light, with a stage, a live feed, and guests in tuxedos who made habitual promises to do what they could before returning to safer, more profitable concerns.
Qingyang sat on a second row, anonymous in a dark dress, a simple pendant hidden under her collar. She had been invited as an expert witness by the city council to speak about the distribution of aid. The invitation seat placed her in easy sight of the brothers. The brothers moved through the room and practiced choreography, a family playing a role on a shared stage. Jinshan gave a speech about legacy and stewardship, and the crowd nodded at the language they had long since been taught to trust. Boyang discussed audits in a tone that suggested moral clarity attached to numbers.
Yutong smiled and told a story about how Shen and Sons had rebuilt neighborhoods. Cameras caught every line, every sanctioned chest puff, while an undercurrent of resentment hummed like electrical wires behind wallpaper. Halfway through the gala, a scream cut through the polished clink of glass and silverware like a dropped crystal. A young woman on the dais, guarding the ceremonial ribbon, had collapsed, her face draining of color. Chairs scraped, a ripple of panic. The gala MC stammered. The crowd leaned in. A camera zoomed. Qingyang stood before she realized she had moved. Her hands were steady. She had seen this before. The color drain, the tightness in a throat. And it was a memory with teeth. She had not been in such a bright room when she had died, but the sensation was old and familiar. The pavilion's training had made this reflexual, triage before spectacle, triage before PR. She pushed through the crowd, kneeling beside the woman. Someone murmured that it might be food poisoning. Someone else suggested a fainting fit. Qingyang's fingers found a pulse, rapid and thready. She looked up and saw the brothers watching from the dais, faces frozen in calculation. The youngest of them, Yutong, mouthed something. It might have been panic. It might have been the layout of their next accusation. She swallowed something, a server said. There's a vial, look, near the floral arrangement. A hush. The camera swiveled like a small, hungry animal. It could have been a domestic accident, someone careless with medication. It could have been malicious. In the mediated world of modern scandal, ambiguity is a weapon. A rumor that a company safeguarder was poisoned would spread like a wildfire that remembered old timber. Qingyang checked the woman's pupils, measured respirations, signaled a nurse in the crowd who had tie-dyed lanyards, and a forgetfulness that often belonged to people who gave all their time. In her mind, the pavilion's protocols unspooled: stabilize airway, remove potential toxins, track source without panic. She reached for the woman's jewelry, trying to ring a contact. The pendant in the woman's hand was a cheap trinket, nothing like the carved jade Qingyang carried. Someone shouted that the catering had been tampered with. Someone else shouted that the family had enemies. An ex-wife of a rival magnate laughed too loud. The feed sped up in posts. Hashtag Shen tainted, hashtag gala scandal. Jinxian's expression slid into a mask of concern that could pass as leadership. This was their theater. They were staging grief and command while the auction of sympathy began. Qingyang had no interest in spectacle. She had methods. She set the woman's jaw, administered a small antidotal protocol that the pavilion used for suspected synthetic sedatives, protocols developed to cope with chemical contamination in remote clinics where conventional testing was not available. It was precise, clinical, and it worked enough to keep the woman breathing.
An ambulance barreled up the glass drive and took the patient with an insistence that made the newsfeed tremble. When the cameras left, the brothers gathered beneath the stage. Boyang's phone displayed a headline in progress, an analysis piece suggesting a targeted attack on event security. The PR team already had talking points. Jingshen's jaw worked like a pulley. "Who is that woman?" he hissed, eyes flicking to where Qingyang had been sitting. She was gone, dispersed into the crowd like a shadow. No one knew her name yet. For the brothers, the incident was a seed. For Qingyang, it was a knot of exposures to be undone and turned. She had saved the life of an unknown woman for the same reason she had once kept nurses from falling asleep on hospital floors, because certain acts are countersigns of who she had been. She did not do it to earn gratitude. She did it because she owed the world what she could give. In the days that followed, the brothers' decoding intensified, and it grew desperate. Jingshen authorized audits into every philanthropic ledger, ordering the legal team to dig up any tie to foreign influence. Boyang demanded the construction of a forensic timeline of Qingyang's movements leading up to the gala. Yutong floated a plan to stage a civil reconciliation, a ploy to force her to reveal herself in a public forum. Their hired analysts, convinced they had found psychological telltales, produced reports that framed her as action-oriented, altruistically motivated, with residual attachment to the family nucleus. It was almost flattering, except the sentimentality missed her chemistry. They were tracing the lines of a life with maps that only drew roads. They made a mistake in the way men prone to certainty always do. They reduced her to patterns and hoped to control a soul with a spreadsheet. They failed to account for the pavilion's principle. People who have been erased often return with a geometry all their own. Qingyang watched them make these mistakes the way a chess player watches an opponent move into a favored trap. She did not gloat. She prepared.
One evening, she visited a small warehouse that served as an unofficial TNG satellite, an otherwise unremarkable place stacked with crates of lab supplies and boxes of donated medicines. She opened a locked cabinet and pulled out a wooden box. Inside lay the pendant, the fracture line of an old life, and a sheet of paper listing names. Liang, the community clinic director; Uncle Liu, who ran a logistics startup; Ma Kei, for Junior Analyst Syndicate; the nurse with the tie-dyed lanyard. Each name had a short note beside it: training completed, supply line secured, public touchpoints. There were dates, but no grand designs, no elaborate revenge maps, only a ledger of small investments made in people. Her plan was not to crush them with a single catastrophic blow.
Her plan was to balance the ledger, to take power where it had been unfairly hoarded and redistribute it toward competence and care. That did not mean she forgave. Forgiveness to Qingyang required a price. A month later, the city's consumer watchdog issued a preliminary report on the gala incident. There were many ambiguities in the chain of custody for the catering supplies. A vendor's subcontractor had unexplained transfers to shell companies. The papers were full of theories. The brothers' stock dipped 3 points. An opportunistic rival ran a morning segment about governance and the importance of independent audits. Investors murmured. It was then that the youngest brother, in a private meeting that leaked as an anonymous clip, asked the question they all feared suddenly might have an answer. Who does she think she is, coming back like this? He did not mean the public. He meant the intimate, humiliating knowledge that the woman they had discarded knew them better than any PR firm ever could. They began to stalk her with technology, open-source intelligence, geotags, pattern recognition. They hired psychologists to parse the timbre of her public statements and to file speeches under categories of controlled compassion or instinctive mercy. They approached old housekeepers, asked questions that slid like needles. They tried to make the intangible into a mapped, actionable thing. They wanted to decode her mind, because they believed that if they could predict her, they could rewrite her actions into something that served them. It is difficult to decode someone when what you want to learn most is the shape of your own conscience through someone else's life. They were searching for validation, not truth. Qingyang let them sift through tempers and data. She let them think their algorithms were wise. She let the pavilion's shadowed techniques, tractable, methodical, humane, do their work in the interstices. When Boyang's analysts came to the warehouse with subpoenas, they found only an ordinariness that puzzled them. Crates of medication with distribution logs, lists of village elders trained in cold chain preservation, receipts for pineapple cake orders. There was no smoking gun. There were, instead, receipts for kindness. The brothers made another error. They began to publicize their attempts to reintegrate damaged family assets, painting themselves as magnanimous stewards. It was a PR gambit designed to make dissenters ashamed of anger, but in their eagerness to control the narrative, they left open a way to be exposed. The more they shouted their virtue, the more the quiet work of reform could be contrasted against their noise. On a rainless night when the towers threw glass light across an indifferent city, Qingyang stood on a balcony with the pendant in her palm. She felt the weight of both lives at once, the life in which she had given everything, and the life in which she now collected herself like a careful account.
The pavilion hummed below, a harmless machine seen only by those who looked for it. Far away, Shen Sons tweeted a glossy photo of the brothers, edited to perfect posture. The family ledger gleamed with polished numbers. She rubbed the fracture line in the pendant with a thumb, and remembered Yuer's small hands when they had once hidden the trinket together, laughing at the lopsided cut of the cake they'd shared. The memory was soft and cruel in the same breath. They made us give everything, she thought, the sentence precise and cold. This time they will watch me spend it well. A little alarm on her phone pulsed, a notification from an old pavilion contact. The gala victim had been discharged. The woman's recovery would make a different headline in a week. A line had turned in Qingyang's favor, not because she had fought for applause, but because the public had begun to notice an alternative to the brothers' self-congratulation: steady competence and small, honest acts. The world has a hunger for stories that show people choosing to keep each other alive. That hunger moves slower than markets, but it is steadier. The brothers did not disappear quietly. They prowled. They convened a private meeting with their legal counsel to consider lawsuits against unidentified benefactors.
They tried to recruit the city's charismatic CEO, Chu Heng, an influential figure with family ties to a royal-backed investment trust, hoping to sway him to their side. Chu Heng had been an object of political caution for years. His name carried weight, and he had allies who read his hand like scripture. Chu Heng himself had been watching the undercurrent with an analytical, almost kindly interest. In public, he remained neutral. His investments favored stability. Secretly, he admired the mathematics of Qingyang's interventions. He had lost trust in pretense long ago. A private message from him to a mutual acquaintance read simply, "She is not an enemy." That message moved like tea poured into a cup, gentle and warming. For the brothers, an ally like Chu Heng would have been a confirmation. For Qingyang, his cautious nod made her task possible. Allies like him could pull levers she could not, regulatory subpoenas, the quiet prestige that prevented cameras from turning away. But allies are not rescues, they are tools, and she understood the difference. She cultivated him with the same measured curiosity she used with everyone, not to seduce him into loyalty, but to show the world she was not a threat. He watched when she delivered a lecture on logistical ethics and sent a text afterwards with a single line, "Well argued." That line would matter later. The brothers escalated their tactics. They tried to manufacture sympathy by orchestrating a small public show of contrition, an award ceremony where they gave the Restoration Initiative a symbolic check. Cameras broadcast their smiles. Commentators called it a turning point.
The event was meant to starve the pavilion of oxygen. It did not work. Among the soft noise of the ceremony, an intern from the pavilion, someone who had started as a data-scrubbing volunteer, posted a thread about supply routes and community clinics, with photos and names and patient stories. It went quiet at first, then loud. The people didn't care for big checks. They kept telling smaller stories. The internet, which the brothers assumed would always bend to antagonisms created by power, found a sliver of truth and nailed it to the wall. For the first time in years, people discussed what competence looked like in the absence of applause. That small victory was enough to unsettle the brothers. The eldest son, enraged by the upstart narratives, convened his analysts and demanded a new strategy, to decode her mind not merely through data, but through her past. "If we understand what she wants," he said, voice low, "we can preempt." It was a dangerous phrase because it was rooted in the same old logic of possession. They began to hire people who specialized in behavioral forensics. They trawled through childhood photos, old school records, whispers from housekeepers who now had new families and new loyalties. They followed the pendant's trail like a breadcrumb. They tried to read the way she blinked, the rhythm of her sentences, as if a body's small habits could be translated into a will. They were trying to translate a woman into a code they could write software to crack. Qingyang watched their attempts with a patience that had nothing to do with arrogance. She had been shaped by a different code, one that valued human resilience over the thrill of public shaming. She let the brothers stitch together their false narratives. She would, when the time came, remove their stitches and show the world the raw seam beneath. Days grew into weeks. A storm of headlines, whispered conferences, and analysts' reports swirled around the tower like a flock of birds. It was a world built of soundbites and snapshots. But beneath the surface, networks of care, the pavilion, Uncle Liu's logistics, Liang's clinic, ran like roots. The next public moment would not be a gala of their making. It would be a public launch for a community health partnership where a public figure would speak, and the brothers would be tempted to use the occasion to produce their decisive coup. They did not yet know that the woman they had tried to erase had already planned to attend. They did not know that she had quietly arranged for support staff, secured transcripts from the pavilion, and built redundancies into a plan that would not depend on applause. She had learned long ago that the only way to rewrite a ledger was to keep writing, page by patient page. She had been dead once and brought back to witness what such systems of quiet, grinding care could create when assembled. Watching the city lights blur into a smear of human endeavor, she slid the pendant into her pocket and turned away from the balcony, to the work that had no audience, and yet might, in time, topple kingdoms. The launch was billed as a partnership between the city and a coalition of private sponsors, a sensible headline for a day when officials wanted to look like they were doing the difficult, bureaucratic work of care. The venue was an austere conference center 2 blocks from Shen Sons Tower, glass and concrete that accepted light without showing off. It was the sort of place where officials announced modest reforms and lobbyists filed dinner receipts. The brothers loved such places because they flattened drama into minutes and bullets on a slide. Qingyang had arranged the details. The pavilion supplied an independent lab booth to demonstrate supply chain integrity, Uncle Lu's trucks lined up to show the logistics. Liang's clinic sent a delegation of people who had actually lived through her interventions. Chu Heng attended as a quiet backer, seated 2 rows behind her with hands folded, a steady presence that did the work of influence without noise. The brothers, predictably, arrived late, as if timing could signal innocence. The room hummed with polite applause. Someone from the city gave the opening remarks, the sort of language that turned policy into a ribbon. A camera panned to the dais, and then, predictably, caught Qingyang in profile. Clean suit, unmoved face. He was all practiced sympathy. Boyang's notes were clipped and sure. Yutong, showing a practiced face that intended affability, smiled for the cameras until the smile reached nothing. From the start, Qingyang noticed the extra security on Jingyang's side. 2 men in black suits who lingered at the edges, a legal team with thick folders, an IT specialist whose sleeve kept tugging at his badge. They had learned from the gala. They would not be caught off guard again. She had expected as much. Her own preparations resembled a slow, patient machine. Evidence had been filed with the consumer watchdog weeks before, along with audited reports tracing the catering subcontractors. She had dropped a sealed complaint at the Financial Regulatory Office that would trigger an independent review in the event of untoward interference. The pavilion had prepared chain of custody logs that could not be dismissed as rumor. The pavilion's legal counsel, disguised in the neutral colors of civic NGOs, sat near the front. The plan was not to ambush them, but to render their ambush impotent. A small throat cleared from the dais. A health official introduced the demonstration of secure logistics. A technician wheeled out a sealed box, its tamper evidence strap intact. Liang's director spoke plainly about the difference between a community clinic that received care and one that received a press release, and the room shifted as reality threaded into the rhetoric.
Then Liang pointed to a woman in the audience, Yuer. It was the moment the brothers had not been prepared for and should have predicted. Yuer walked slowly down the aisle, a small, deliberate figure in a modest dress. She bore no theatrics. She wore only the quiet dignity of someone whose life had narrowed and then widened again. The flash of cameras caught her face, old lines and fierce, sudden softness, and the social feed lurched. Somewhere near the back, someone whispered, "Isn't that?" And then it spread like a mote of light. Yuer had been exiled. She had survived by going invisible, by working kitchens and small bakeries where the day began in the dark and the pain of being blamed could be minimized. Qingyang had found ways to support her, anonymously at first, then with the pavilion's discreet patrons, and had used the ledger to patch small holes. Rent paid in a city far from the tower, a medical bill cleared, a bakery oven bought in secret. Yuer had never been the woman in the headlines. With time and safety, she had become someone who could stand in a room and say a single sentence that cut through the practiced syllables. "Shen Yuer," Liang said, and she stepped to the microphone. Her voice carried. She did not come with accusations alone. She came with the names of patients who had lived because a shipment arrived on time, who had jobs preserved by a small logistics operation that paled beside Shen and Sons, but had real workers who remembered faces. People in the crowd shifted, recognizing neighbors and unremarked kindnesses. A thread of testimony built into a small, hard rope. In the moment, the brothers realized the narrative had cracked open. Their faces read varying degrees of panic. Jinshan's jaw tightened. Boyang's hands found the folder that had been his comfort for so many negotiations. Yutong's expression wavered as if he had been struck by something unfashioned. They moved to Decode before they had fully understood. Boyang commanded the IT specialist to pull up the pavilion's website traffic logs, to show funding flows, to see if a foreign hand could be connected. Yutong tried the gentler approach, leaning into the moderator and suggesting a Q&A for the anonymous benefactor. Jinshan left the dais and spoke to a reporter, trying to anchor the story with phrases, unexplained ties, questionable independent actors, the need for corporate transparency. Qingyang had anticipated the push for distraction. She watched as Boyang's screens flickered to life, as analysts whispered into earpieces. She had anticipated their attempt to make foreignness contagious. She had already put international compliance documents into the public record through an NGO friend, preempting claims of foreign interference. She had anticipated the attempt to make the pavilion look secretive. The pavilion's secret files were now legally registered as intellectual property entrusted to an independent steward. A reality of legal process is that the law moves slowly, but when moved deliberately, it bends towards consequences that cannot be undone with trifles. Mid-presentation, the brothers made a more desperate bit. An analyst from Boyang's circle tentatively announced a finding, a colonial address linked to a charity that had once received pavilion grants. A thread of commentary spread. Were these funds sent abroad? Was the pavilion a channel of foreign money? The anchor asked the health official for comment. A pause. An uncomfortable moment when the air must be filled with something. Qingyang stepped forward.
not to fight, but to dismantle their claim with the tiny, surgical etiquette of truth. She walked to the mic, voice steady. She explained, without melodrama, the provenance of the grant, the independent oversight, the names of the trustees and their legal obligations. She cited dates. She presented receipts, not the kind of staged documents a PR machine could manufacture, but legal filings, notarized and time-stamped. Her calm slid into the room like water into a basin. The brothers' upset had become a public surgery. In the margins of the web, analysts whispered about the data connecting her to something unnamed. The tactic to paint her as foreign-born or foreign-funded relied on xenophobic reflexes. It required an audience to believe that outside equals unsafe. On a live feed where Liang's clinic users spoke of ambulances that arrived, that rhetorical move sounded mean and small. She had, however, set a deeper snare. A regulatory whistleblower she'd quietly cultivated months earlier stepped up on the pavilion's authority line and provided a chain of custody log in real time, timestamps, GPS waypoints, and a digital certificate that proved the shipments had been cleared through a vendor that the brothers' legal team had repeatedly proposed as clean. The chain of custody had been designed not just as evidence of competence, but as an unambiguous map that would reveal off-ledger transfers. If the brothers had been inserting shell transfers into that chain, the log would show them. And the log showed where the transfers had instead rerouted through a set of shell companies whose accounting overlapped with an asset manager who had, coincidentally, purchased a controlling interest in one of the brothers' charitable vendors. The camera panned to Boyang, and the color drained from his face. Jingshan stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Yutong fumbled for a line of words that could reverse the public's perception, but found only the noise of denial. Panic often makes men of power do smallest, meanest things. Even as the regulatory log populated on a large screen, Boyang's counsel tried an emergency motion to have the footage declared inadmissible. It is telling that when one has power, one reaches for legalistic refuge rather than the harder labor of humility.
But the larger mechanism of public accountability had been primed. Social feeds spooled the footage of Liang's clinic before the lawyers could file their injunction. Local council members called for an independent investigation. The initial tactic to paint the pavilion as foreign, used to inoculate the public against Qingyang, became the thread that led to the brothers' own employees, drivers, kitchen staff, junior accountants, talking to reporters about unusual transfers and orders to make the numbers look clean. Jingxian called a private meeting in a glass-walled conference room afterward. His voice had the flatness of a man trying to force calm. "We must find her pattern," he said. "We must decode her. If we can see her next move, we can control it." They tried everything in the weeks that followed. Behavioral forensics, as promised, became their favorite conduit. They contracted a boutique firm that promised pattern recognition and psychometric mapping. The firm produced visuals, heat maps of her public appearances, sentiment analysis of her speech, predictive models of philanthropic interest. They mapped her pauses, the length of her sighs, the cadence of her sentences. Using scraped social media data, they argued they could anticipate where she would step next: clinics, warehouses, community centers. If pattern recognition had been their only weapon, they might have cut off her next move. But pattern recognition works only when the map corresponds to motive. They mistook consistency of habit for predictability of strategy. Qingyang had patterns, yes. She loved small kitchens and she visited clinics, but her motives could not be reduced to a heat map. Those who had shaped her, years of sewing other people's hems, nights in waiting rooms, the bitter experience of being traded for the family's image, had taught her to make kindness itself a form of strategy. She was predictable in care, but the object of that care could be purposely misleading. She used habit as camouflage. When the brothers finally orchestrated their decoding test, a staged reconciliation event where they publicly misrepresented goodwill and demanded a joint statement, she agreed. The cameras hummed and the hall filled with people who wanted to see the drama of reconciliation. The brothers had rehearsed scripts that would make them look contrite and wise. They had lined the event with press, ready to mine her words for leverage. Qingyang arrived with a small box of pineapple cakes. The sight of such a humble offering in a glossy hall was a simple, disarming gesture. Yutong's smile, confident as it was, faltered when the box was opened, and a woman in the front row, someone who had once worked in a Shen household and whose parents had been saved by a donated shipment, stood up and said simply, "These are the cakes my father ate when he came home from the hospital for the first time because of your trucks." The hall script stuttered.
The brothers attempted to steer the microphone toward their staged talking points. "We are family," Jingxian said, in that moderated register men use to claim moral high ground. "We have made mistakes. We invite dialogue." Boyang fluffed his papers as if they were already the proof of their virtue. Then Qingyang spoke, and speaking from the quiet invited a different kind of theater. She did not decry them with fire. She did not sing of betrayal. She told a sequence instead, small, connected facts about a delivery, a phone call that had been made in the middle of a storm, an off-the-books payment for a van that had carried vaccines to a district with no prior service. She cited names who could corroborate, and then when the room was listening and the microphones were live, she read an auditor's notation that had been buried in one of the brothers' vendors' filings, a notation that a junior accountant had flagged and been ordered to ignore. She read the flag verbatim, not to convict, but to show a pattern where choices had been made. In the public's mind, the brothers' gestures of reconciliation now sounded thin beside these practical human things. People are less impressed by grand statements than by small, replicated truths. The firm that had hoped to decode her behavior now had to account for human testimony that suggested material theft of accountability, not merely emotional upset. The brothers' final gambit was crude and desperate. They leaked, through a channel that they believed would shame her, a scandalous but false suggestion that Qingyang had once attempted to harm herself in a way that suggested mental instability, and that, implied in the leak, made her unreliable and dangerous. It was a low, old tactic. Change the subject with the most personal scare you can manufacture. When the leak hit the feeds, a voice from inside the pavilion spoke up and refused to let the rumor stand. The pavilion had saved clinical notes from the time in question. A therapist who had seen her years ago had written a note not of shame but of intervention, a record of a night where a plan had been prevented, where a responsible person held a hand and called a doctor. The note was a quiet testament to care. Qingyang had once been on the edge, yes, she had also been saved. The pavilion's transparency here was not a confession, but a display of what interventions look like, messy, human, and resolvable. The brothers had hoped the leak would drive pity and then suspicion. Instead, the public response turned to a different kind of anger, toward those who weaponized someone's pain. The brothers' move backfired because they miscalculated the social cost of cruelty. It was one thing to fight a public policy fight, it was another to punish human vulnerability for gain.
Between the official hearings and the noisy public narratives, the case landed where it would have to land, before a regulatory tribunal convened in the boardroom that had once been used for family announcements. The tribunal was convened not as a melodramatic court, but as a formal inquiry, subpoenas, sworn testimony, and cross-examination. It was the place where the brothers' decoding effort would face the rigor of procedure. As the tribunal assembled, Qingyang felt an old memory like a needle prick her skin, the fluorescent night when she had nearly unmade herself. It came without drama, a short, sudden coldness, a reflex that steadied her. She had wanted once to end the ledger of debt she believed she'd created by living. That memory no longer had the absolute terror it once carried. It carried instead proof that someone could be made to live past the point of despair. The thought hardened into resolve. Chu Hang presented first, not as a savior, but as someone who had enough distance to judge the work. He described for the tribunal what a trustworthy partner looked like. He spoke of conservatorship and fiduciary duty, of documents that matched public filings and evidence of misallocated funds. He did not use the rhetoric of heroics. Instead, he offered technical clarity that made the truth daily and difficult to ignore. The pavilion's chief scientist testified about the supply chain, about the preservation of samples, about the software that tracked inventory and would now be used forensics. There was a moment, technical, dry, when a file was pulled up and a server log exposed a pattern of transfers that matched an off-book account controlled through an entity owned by a firm Jingshen had recently advised. Boyang's eyes flicked to the screen and then away. Yutong tried to interpose a question about the legality of the data acquisition, but the tribunal's chair asked calmly whether the data had been gathered through proper means. It had. The law was methodical in ways men of instant action underestimate. The brothers' counsel tried to present a counter-narrative, a new audit that explained the transfers as clerical reclassification, a mislabeling that had nothing to do with personal profit. That defense requires both time and a sympathetic judge. In the court of public accountability, where NGO reports, social feed narratives, and the whispers of junior staff had joined, it was weak. The legal scrutiny focused on individual choices, who signed, who approved, who looked away. Then came the live testimony that some would later call the turning point. A junior accountant, someone who had once been a boy who delivered tea to the Shen office, and whose job had been an assignment of moral inconvenience, took the stand. He spoke of an instruction to delete a line item, of being told to clean the books to match the public projection.
He testified about the pressure of whispered threats and the smell of smoke in a conference room where burning trust was figurative and then literal when a folder, meant to be evidence, was found charred in a stairwell. The man's hands trembled as he held the microphone. He did not speak elegantly. He spoke small, honest sentences, and they landed like pebbles. The tribunal clerk asked if he had proof. He offered an email chain found in his archive with a header that matched an internal IP address logged to the brothers' legal server. The email's tone was clinical and precise, asks that could be signed and traced to intent. The room grew quieter. People read. Jin Xian rose then, the old posture of authority collapsing into the pale face of a man whose empire was a series of obligations he could no longer afford. He tried to speak, to explain intent away as miscommunication. The tribunal demanded clarity. Did he personally authorize the movement of funds? He stammered. In such moments, men of power look for allies. Boyang offered a flat denial, and Yutong, too late, too loud, began to cry. There were consequences to those cries. The tribunal recommended a set of immediate measures: temporary suspension of the brothers' executive privileges, an independent audit overseen by the city, and a referral to a prosecutor for potential embezzlement charges where the evidence supported it. It was not theatrical revenge. It was the slow machinery of law catching up with choices. Qingyang could have demanded much more. She could have called for criminal prosecution and the severing of every thread that connected the brothers to the family trust. But her life had been one of witnessing what the absolute end of a person could do to a family and a city. She had seen that annihilation had not produced justice where she had once hoped. Instead, she chose to shape the outcome into something surgical. She rewrote the family's charter in the tribunal's public appendices. There were protests. There were shout-outs from strangers online urging harsher punishment. She considered them all. Then she did what she had always done. She balanced a ledger with human calculation. She proposed, in a document submitted to the tribunal, a new corporate governance model. The Shen family trust would be reconstituted as a publicly accountable holding with a board that included community representatives, pavilion liaisons, and independent auditors. Key community services, logistics, clinics, research labs would become charitable arms with dedicated oversight, funded by the company's dividend, but ring-fenced from private appropriation. The brothers would be removed from executive authority pending compliance with a rehabilitation and restitution plan. They could reclaim roles only if they submitted to training and oversight, and if they repaid ill-gotten gains or demonstrated genuine acts of restitution. The tribunal accepted her motion with amendments.
It was not total victory in the gladiatorial sense, but it shut down the channels that let a few men convert a company into a private plaything. It returned resources to real service. It also offered the brothers a way forward, accountability, and the refusal of absolute exile. Outside the tribunal, the public burst into mixed reactions. Some demanded harsher measures. Some whispered that Qingyang had shown mercy where mercy was naive. She understood both positions. In her office that night, she sat with the pendant in a small palm. The fracture line had once symbolized a break that could not be mended. Now it was a reminder that repair is a labor of hands and time. A week later, in a small courtroom that had been converted into a restorative panel, Qingyang met with the three brothers. It was not a trial in the old sense. It was a mediated session where restitution plans were signed. Jinxian, rigid, proud, refused the initial terms. He wanted the company's control back instantly and threatened legal action. Qingyang let him speak until his voice ran dry. There was a thin, awful yearning in his eyes, a hunger to be object of reverence again. She recognized the look because she had lived within it, a desire to be declared king of a ledger because the ledger had once given order to an unruly life. Boyang, by contrast, was quieter. He had been the man who trusted numbers as absolutes. Now, reduced to numbers that showed how much had been shifted, he had to choose whether to confess the small rationalizations that had let theft feel like accounting. He signed one of the restitution schedules and agreed to oversight. Whether his agreement was out of guilt, fear of prosecution, or sincerity would be proven in dull increments over a decade. Yutong, fragile and sincere in public, begged for a chance to learn, to work in the community logistics hub, and to repair relationships he'd once tried to manipulate. He wanted to return to people he had wronged, and to learn how to move through the world without smoothing the edges of truth. Qingyang offered terms that were not charity. Restitution required honest labor. The brothers would not be erased, but would be disqualified from controlling corporate machinery. Instead, they would have to work under supervision in community projects, submitting to audits that would be public and repeated. They would fund independent scholarships and rebuild medical supplies depots. They would issue public apologies and support the pavilion's programs without interference. For those who refused, the law would take a more punitive route. The terms were both medicine and measurement. Yu Er stood at the side of the room when the brothers signed. Afterward, when the talking was done and the cameras had left, she and Qingyang sat in a small garden behind the regulatory building. There was a single paper plate with 2 pieces of pineapple cake between them. The gesture was quiet, no speeches, just 2 women sharing something small.
"I thought they'd taken everything," Yu Er said, eyes on the small plate. "I thought there was nothing to come back for." Qingyang reached across and broke the cake into uneven halves, the way they used to as children when generosity meant imperfect slices. "They took what they thought they could," she said. "But people have hands. People can build again." Yu Er laughed then, a sound that was half relief and half astonishment. The pendant she had once given to Qingyang was now looped on a thin cord around Yu Er's neck, the fracture line catching the light. "Keep this," Yu Er said abruptly. "Not for the memory of what they did, but because you mended me too." Qingyang shook her head and slid the pendant back into Yu Er's naum. She kept the small carved circle for herself, a symbolic credit to the life she had reclaimed. Gift and token exchanged, they rose to leave. The brothers' lives diverged. Jinxian launched legal fights. He filed for an injunction and threatened countersuits. He was a man used to dominance. He looked for the old levers. The legal machinery obliged him with delays and filings. But in the months that followed, the public's attention moved to the small work of rebuilding. Clinics reopened, a logistics hub started modeling its routes with the pavilion software, and Uncle Liu's startup grew with the transparent contracts Qingyang had insisted upon. Boyang's restitution was procedural. He spent early mornings in a depot watching pallets, and late nights in auditor meetings learning the brutal economy of oversight. Yu Tong, who still bore the scars of performance anxiety and a hunger for approval, trundled between volunteer shifts at a clinic and pavilion workshops, gradually learning to do the small necessary work without cameras. It was, in a way, the most expensive learning curve any of them had ever been forced to pay. Public life resumed its dull, complicated circuits. The tribunal's amendments were codified into corporate law precedents in that city. Other conglomerates watched and adjusted their contracts. The pavilion's model for accountable philanthropy spread to 2 neighboring municipalities. Chu Hang's restraint support became a quiet case study in influence that does not humiliate. Qingyang kept building. Repair work became not a single act of vengeance, but a long, organized campaign to systematize the goodness she believed the world could afford. She started a fellowship that trained former junior associates in ethical auditing. She funded scholarships for women in logistics and medicine from the districts the brothers had once only photographed for press releases. The pavilion scaled its research into a modular kit for small clinics that could be set up in a week, not months, and the kits included transparent supply chain software that eliminated obscure transfers. Even as she worked, she kept an eye on the ledger. She insisted on private audits and public reports. No more shadows where money could hide.
It was a small revolution of transparency, the modest end of what had been a cruel middle. A short while later, a different test came. A rival conglomerate attempted to buy a minority stake in Shen Family Trust at a fire sale price, hoping to capitalize on the brothers' distraction. It was a classic move: buy low, control later. The board's new governance charter, Qingyang's centerpiece, required that any outsider purchase be vetted not only by financial metrics, but also by a community panel. The rival's bid failed because the board, now with community representation, asked the hard questions. Who would keep the clinics running? Who would ensure logistics stayed local? The rival left empty-handed, a small victory that proved the charter worked. The 3 brothers watched these events from various edges of their own humiliation. Jinxian mounted a long, expensive legal campaign aimed at the tribunal's findings. He hired counsel, sought sympathetic articles, and arranged for sympathetic commentators to question the pavilion's data. But the law is methodical, and in a system of evidence and public verification, sustenance comes slowly. Jinxian's resources could not manufacture the facts the tribunal had recorded. He began to appear in fewer public forums, preferring instead op-eds that read like policy statements devoid of human feeling. Boyang's slow, pragmatic rehabilitation found a brittle sheen of dignity in audits and audits' humdrum competence. He became, perhaps reluctantly, useful. Yu Tong's work with clinics earned him a measure of grace. He learned to stitch bandages, to carry vaccines, to say sorry and mean it. Through the months and then years that followed, public memory softened. People are not given to endless fury. They are given to the small acts that keep daily life turning. But the ledger did not forget. Whenever a new scandal rose, someone would remember the way the pavilion had documented its supplies, the way Liang's clinic kept a ledger of patients' names, the way an independent board could not be bought. In time, these procedures hardened into public expectation. One winter night, when the air had the brittle edge of a city that had learned to keep itself going, Qingyang walked into a low-lit bakery where Yu Er had finally opened a small shop.
The oven glowed with warmth, and the smell of pineapple cake was a simple, homely force. The bakery was not opulent. It had a single chalkboard menu and a handwritten sign, open for everyone. People queued. A nurse came in for a cup of tea. Yue handed her a pastry, and they sat together at a small wooden table. There was no ceremony, no cameras, only a quiet that had the weight of all the small things they'd rebuilt. Qingyang watched a child tucked into her mother's coat as the child glanced at the pendant around Yuer's neck. The fracture lines shone, hardly noticeable. You could have rebuilt everything, Yuer said quietly, breaking a small piece of cake. Why keep the pendant?
Qingyang considered the question. It was not about memory alone. It was about accountability and promise. Remembrance is a design choice, she said. We decide what to carry forward. I keep it to remember what mercy costs. The child toddled over and reached, and Yuer let her touch the pendant. The child's finger traced the fracture and then returned to her mother's hand. There was an ordinary tenderness in it, noiseless and durable. Later, in a quiet office where maps of logistics routes hung like constellations on the wall, Qingyang drafted the final addendum that would formalize the trust's long-term governance. It codified what she had learned, that power must be accountable, that charity without structure becomes theft, that mercy must never be a blanket that permits exploitation. She wrote the clauses not in legalese alone, but in phrases that would later be used as teaching tools in the pavilion's ethics courses. She had the chance in those months to close the ledger with different degrees of harshness. She had revenge within her reach, legal, financial, reputational. She chose instead to order consequences with proportionality. There were punishments, yes, fines, suspensions, and in some cases prosecutions where the evidence was clear. There were also opportunities for restoration if the offenders showed sustained, verifiable change. Her measure was not sentiment. It was a calibrated instrument of social repair. On the anniversary of the gala that had started it all, the city held a modest ceremony to inaugurate a new depot co-funded by the trust. It was not a spectacle like the brothers had thrown, no chandeliers, no drones, but a clear, functional space where trucks would load vaccines and food for the vulnerable. Qingyang stood on a small platform. The crowd included clinic workers, warehouse hands, people whose names had been footnotes in the old family's press releases. She spoke about small things, the importance of keeping promises, of choosing systems that outlast individual whims. She did not use melodrama. She mentioned Yuer by name and thanked the pavilion volunteers who had kept lists and learned how to do things right. People clapped in the way of people who have work to do. The applause did not feel like a coronation. It felt like a hand on a shoulder. Back at her office that evening, she took out the pendant and turned it over in her palm. The fracture was not gone. It had settled into the object like the memories settled into her life. She thought of the ledger, of the nights she'd sat in waiting rooms, of the hands she had held. She thought of the brothers, of how men who mistake family for entitlement can change, if not always into saints, then into workers, and how society's demand for restitution can demand the slow work of repair rather than the spectacle of retribution. There were nights when the old bitterness returned in a rush. She did not pretend otherwise. Revenge has a delicious, corrosive taste.
But she had seen what sharp annihilation did. She had been a body once left by the wayside. This time she would not be reduced to a footnote. She would write the ledger of the future with care. Outside, the city's lights blinked like a constellation of small possibilities. A message from Chu Hang appeared on her phone. Not bad. She smiled at the dry generosity of the phrase, the understatement of a man who had watched systems for decades. She locked the pendant in a small drawer and took out a pair of pineapple cakes wrapped in waxed paper. She sent one to Liang's clinic and another to the depot where Boyang had started his early shifts, an unannounced gift. It was not a grand gesture. It was a continuity, a repetition of small things that had proven more enduring than a single grand act. In the months that followed, there were appeals and countersuits, small headlines and opinion pieces. The brothers, living under public scrutiny and the watchful bureaucracy Qingyang had helped instantiate, were forced to choose between persistent legal wrangling and the slow, cheaper labor of change. Yutong took a job bundling vaccine kits and occasionally watched the trucks leave to districts that had not received service in decades. Boyang attended auditor training courses and learned to ask the petty, persistent questions that make financial work honest.
Jingxian raged and litigated until the legal system's dryness consumed both his time and most of his political airtime. When the dust settled into a new pattern, Qingyang walked sometimes into the pavilion's labs to teach. She taught volunteers about logistical ethics, about the anatomy of rumor, about how to design systems that could not be easily gamed. She taught about mercy as a structure, not a feeling. Students came from municipal offices and private NGOs, and sometimes, rarely, from other conglomerates who wanted to replicate the trust's model. They asked her why she had not sought greater vengeance, why she had left options open for men who had wronged her so deeply. Because annihilation ends more than its target, she told a roomful of planners once. It severs the small hands that keep the city's machines from grinding people's lives to dust. If you destroy all the corrupt actors, you may also destroy the people their corruption hid. Instead, design systems where corruption is hard and service is easy. Her words were practical and perhaps cold to those who had wanted to witness theatrical punishment, but to those who had run clinics and sour vaccines, they were a map. Years later, on another ordinary afternoon, an envelope arrived at her office. It contained a small sketch done by a child from a clinic she had funded, a picture of a truck, the pavilion's logo drawn in bright crayons, and in the corner 2 women with a pendant between them. She pinned it to the wall near her desk. She had not rewritten the world. No one does.
But she had rewritten the ledger that governed her family and her city in a way that valued repair over spectacle. She had bound the brothers' fate to a public contract rather than private whims. She had given those who had once been hurt places in which they could recover, not as an indulgence, but as a practical method of long-term stability. On quiet nights, she still sometimes replayed memory, a short flash of fluorescent light or the smell of pineapple cake in a kitchen that had never been kind. But the flash had less power now. It had been folded into a longer fabric of action, supplies tracked, clinics opened, a bakery where children queued for cheap, warm pastries. It was a life that measured itself in small things that mattered. She kept the pendant in a drawer for a long time, and then, one day, put it on again. The fracture glittered in the light. She walked through the pavilion to the depot, where trucks backed up like patient beasts. A child waved from a window. A nurse called her name with affection that had nothing to do with headlines. She handed the pendant to Yue in the depot office, not as a relic, but as a symbol of mutual obligation. Keep it where people can see it, she told Yue, not to remember pain, but to remember work. Yue tied the pendant around a workshop post where volunteers left notes. The little fracture faced the room like a scar that had been made useful. There were still people who would try to decode her, to read her motives and map them into predictable actions. There would always be those who wanted to make human beings into algorithms. But the most enduring lesson of the years that followed was that human beings, once trained in the small discipline of care and subject to structures of accountability, do not remain simple threats. They can be instruments of steady repair, awkward and slow, and finally durable. Qingyang had come back to spend her life not on a ledger of profit, but on the small tallies that keep people alive. They had once watched her give everything. Now they watched her spend it well. For the city and for the trust and for the people she had saved, that was enough. If you want to follow Qingyang's next steps, how she trains a new generation of ethical auditors and rebuilds other broken trusts, watch the next installment. The pendant's fracture did not vanish. It was present the way all scars are, a remnant of pain and a testament to repair. Qingyang took a small bite of pineapple cake at a workbench, tasted sugar and salt, and set to her maps. The ledger of the future would be written patiently, page by page, page.